Vladimir Kara-Murza will be there. There's a documentary, and he's going to be talking. This will be at the, let's see if I have the Kerner Johnson Building's Bradford Auditorium. And because response is so great, they had to move it there, which is a larger facility. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thanks so much for coming on this morning.
Thank you. It's great to be on your show. Good morning.
So let's talk about, first of all, what people are going to experience tonight at Hamilton College.
Well, tonight we're going to have a screening of my documentary about Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was the leader of the democratic opposition in Russia. He was once deputy prime minister, regional governor, four-term member of parliament, and seen by many people as the likely successor to President Boris Yeltsin at the end of the 1990s. Of course, as we know, history decided differently, and a man by the name of Vladimir Putin came to power and began very quickly to transform Russia from the imperfect democracy that it was back in the 90s to the perfect authoritarian regime that it is today. And unlike many people who were considered to be Democrats back in the 90s in Russian politics, but who decided to settle for a quiet and comfortable existence under the Putin regime, either go into business or join the government or, in the worst case, leave the country, Boris Nemtsov did not do that. He decided to stay, and he decided to fight, because he could not stand idly by and watch the future of Russia being destroyed by an authoritarian kleptocratic regime. And for years, his voice, the voice of Boris Nemtsov, was the clearest and the loudest voice in opposition to the authoritarianism and corruption of the Putin regime. He led protest marches, tens of thousands of people against domestic repression, against the Kremlin's foreign adventures, including its war in Ukraine. He publicized and exposed abuses and corruption by government officials. He campaigned internationally, including here in the United States, for accountability in the form of targeted sanctions on human rights violators. And throughout all of these years, he was denounced by Russian state television as a traitor, a foreign agent, as happens to opponents of Vladimir Putin. He was repeatedly arrested and jailed at peaceful opposition demonstrations. He was physically assaulted by pro-Kremlin gangs, but he would not be silenced, and he would not stop. So they stopped him the only way they could when, in February of 2015, Boris Nemtsov was killed on a bridge right in front of the Kremlin.
Personal for you, you were very close to him.
It is indeed very personal. He was my closest friend. He was actually godfather to my younger daughter, which in Russia makes you family. And this is, yes, I cannot see this in political terms. For me, this is above all an enormous and immeasurable personal loss. But with this film, I wanted people to see, people both in Russia and abroad, because we have shown this film in more than 30 cities in Russia and now in more than 20 cities outside of Russia. And so Hamilton College will be, I think, the 25th on the list today. And I wanted people to see the real Boris Nemtsov, not the caricature image created by the Kremlin's propaganda machine, but the real person, the real human being, and the real political leader, without the lies, the slander, and the propaganda that surrounded him. And if I was able to do that, then I consider that my task was fulfilled. And so tonight, as you said, at Hamilton College, we will have the screening of this documentary. I'm very grateful to Professor Sharon Rivera for inviting me to Hamilton. This will be my first time in college. I've never been before. I'm very much looking forward to it. The road looks really Russian today, by the way, in terms of the snow. So
we felt very Russian this winter. I do have to say. I want to ask you. You remember August '91, the revolution that led to a democratic Russia for a time, anyway. I read that you believe that there, and it's a fact, that only then was there has not been a legitimate election since 2000 in Russia. When Putin came into power, I found it interesting. You believe his first victim was the media.
Absolutely.
And talk about the importance of that and how that has affected Russia today.
Well, in terms of legitimate elections, you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at all the reports from observers from the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in all Russian elections for the past 18 years, the last time they assessed a national election in Russia to have conformed to basic democratic standards was the election in 2000. So every election since then, parliamentary or presidential, has been assessed as falling far short of basic standards of democracy. So it is a fact that the regime we have in power in Russia today is not based on democratic legitimacy, is not based on free and fair elections, and is not the product of a free choice of the Russian people. I think it's very important to remember that. And you're absolutely right. The first target of the Putin regime was independent media. When Mr. Putin came to power, 3 of the 4 nationwide television channels in Russia were not controlled by the state. They were independent of the government. And he very quickly moved to change that situation. And in fact, the first armed raid by the Prosecutor General Service and the tax police on the offices of the parent company of NTV, the then largest independent television station in Russia, was conducted on day 4 after Mr. Putin's inauguration as president in May of 2000. And within the first 3 years of his rule, Mr. Putin has either shut down or taken over every independent national television channel in our country. So today, all nationwide TV in Russia is controlled from one place, from the Kremlin. It is directly managed and guided, and basically our TV stations have turned into propaganda tools, propaganda outlets, just as it was back in the Soviet times. And you know, if you listened to, or if you watched rather Russian state television, which I would not advise you to do if you value your nervous system, but if you did, you would hear that people who oppose Mr. Putin, people like myself, and of course people like Boris Nemtsov, are traitors and foreign agents and part of the fifth column, that Russia is surrounded by enemies, and there's this valiant and great Mr. Putin who's standing, to defend our national interests. Of course, nothing could be further from reality. It's believed
you were poisoned twice, and it seems that that could have been an attempt on your life, an assassination. You believe it was poisoning?
Well, that's not a question of believing. That's what my official diagnosis states from my hospital in Moscow. It says toxic action by an unidentified substance, which translated from the medical into human language means poisoning. And both times, the first time this happened was in 2015. The second time was last year, 2017, both times in Moscow. And both times I went into a coma with multiple organ failure, and doctors told my wife that I had about a 5% chance to survive. So I'm very, very happy and very fortunate to be speaking with you right now. And I have, of course, absolutely no doubt that this was an attempt, or these were 2 attempts to kill. Because, when you're given 5% chance to survive, that's not how they scare you. Yeah. That's something more than that. And I have absolutely no doubt, of course, that this was retribution for my political activities in the Russian opposition. And I think more specifically my work over the last several years in support of the targeted personal international sanctions against corrupt officials and human rights abusers in Mr. Putin's regime.
You call Putin you believe that it's reached the point of dictatorship?
Oh, absolutely. It's a personal dictatorial regime that we have in Russia. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. I have a listener who is Russian who is asking a question. Is there a current U.S. politician that you are impressed with, and if so, why?
I can tell you from personal experience. So for the last about 7 years, even more now, 7 or 8 years, I've been closely working with members of the United States Congress on several initiatives, and I would name 2 in particular. One initiative was the one we already touched on. It was the Magnitsky Act that was passed back in 2012, which imposed targeted personal sanctions on human rights abusers in the Putin regime. And on that initiative, we worked closely together with Boris Nemtsov, with members of Congress. And more recently, in fact, last year now, in 2017, I've worked also with members of Congress on a bill to designate the street in front of the Russian embassy in Washington in memory of Boris Nemtsov as Boris Nemtsov Plaza. And it has, in fact, now been done, thanks to the leadership also of the Washington, D.C. Council. And in fact, next month, on the 27th of February, which will be the 3rd anniversary of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, we will officially unveil the street, Boris Nemtsov Plaza, in front of the Russian embassy in Washington. And on those 2 initiatives, what I found from personal experience is that such issues, such principled issues related to human rights and democracy, are best done on a bipartisan basis. And so when the Magnitsky Act was being shepherded through Congress, the 2 leading figures on it were Senator Ben Cardin from the Democratic side and Senator John McCain from the Republican side. And on Boris Nemtsov Plaza, with this initiative, the two leading voices were, on the Republican side, it was Senator Marco Rubio, and on the Democrat side, Senator Christopher Coons of Delaware. And I think, frankly, human rights and rule of law and democracy should not be partisan issues. And we were very happy to work with U.S. political leaders across the aisle in order to get these things done. And I'm very grateful for their support on this. Overnight,
the White House put out a list of politicians and billionaires in Russia. Some were hoping there would be sanctions based on interference in our election from last year. The White House has decided that the list goes out, but no sanctions. What's your thought on that?
Well, in fact, this list was not supposed to be sanctions per se. It was mandated by Section 241 of the countering of the big sanctions law that was passed last August. And it was not supposed to introduce sanctions by itself. This was always supposed to be a publication of names, but it's a very important thing in itself, because I want to remind our listeners that the Section 241 calls for the listing of people who are, on the one hand, close to the current political regime in Russia and Vladimir Putin personally, and on the other hand, who have been involved in significant acts of corruption. And so, with the publication of this list, it is no longer, opposition activists or NGOs or independent journalists who are calling these people, who are denouncing them as corrupt. It is now an official report by the United States government. So, in effect, these individuals, and I think there are 210 names in that list that was published last night, they are now officially, on the government level, recognized as being involved in corruption. I think this is a very, very significant act in itself. And also knowing how, the international banking system works, I think, any respectable financial institution would think twice before doing business with anybody listed in that report.
So you feel the just releasing that report with those names is extremely important.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. I think that naming and shaming is very significant.
Yep.
And again, the most significant aspect from our point of view in this is that these people, it's the same as with the Magnitsky Act. It's one thing when even a very respectable NGO calls an official in Putin's government a human rights abuser. It's a very different thing when this statement is made by the United States government based on a very high standard of proof, and this is also the case with this report published last night.
We are talking with Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's the vice chair of Open Russia, a politician. You are a journalist. You're an activist, and your documentary will be featured tonight and shown tonight at Hamilton College in the Kerner Johnson Building's Bradford Auditorium. I want to ask. We got a couple more minutes. Your thoughts. Did Vladimir Putin interfere with our elections in 2016?
Well, first of all, let's wait how all these congressional investigations and all these probes are conducted. I mean, it seems like there are enough Russian citizens trying to meddle into U.S. politics. I don't want to be one more. So I'll leave this issue to your domestic processes. But I'll just, as a general comment, I would say that if that is indeed found to be the case, as a result of all those investigations and hearings, it would not, frankly, be very surprising, because the Putin regime has been known to interfere in different elections over the years, of course, beginning with elections in Russia, which are not free and fair and democratic, as we discussed with you a minute ago, but also in other countries such as Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. There's been a documented case of financial support from Moscow to a far-right party in France a few years ago. So if it is indeed found that there has been interference, that should not come as a surprise to anyone.
Yeah. What would he gain from interfering?
Well, I think generally any kind of destabilization or chaos in a major Western democracy, is a good thing as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned. And also, what's important to understand about the nature of the regime that we have in Russia today is that there are two sides to this coin. Domestic repression is always accompanied by external aggression, and this has been the case with all authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in recent Russian or Soviet history. Why should a regime that disrespects its own citizens and violates its own laws be expected to respect international norms or the interests or the sovereignty of other countries? It does not. And so everything that Mr. Putin's regime has been doing inside our country is naturally translated into aggressive actions abroad.
Is there a final question? Because we could go for another hour and a half, to be honest. Final question. Is there someone in history of the world, that you would compare Vladimir Putin to?
Well, all analogies are always, you have to be careful about historical analogies, and I'm a historian by education. I think Mr. Putin himself wants to kind of style himself as a mixture of, Russian czars and Soviet general secretaries, as this kind of a strongman ruler who rules with an iron fist. Of course, what he should also remember is the way these things have ended in Russia. And you mentioned a minute ago the Democratic Revolution of August 1991, which I'm old enough to remember. I was 10 at the time, but when it's something as important as this happens, you do remember things like this. And I remember the tanks on the streets of my city, Moscow. And I also remember the people, the unarmed, peaceful demonstrators who went out in their thousands and stood in front of those tanks that the leaders of the Communist Party and the KGB sent into Moscow. And when those people came out, those tanks stopped and turned away. And I think that's one lesson of history Mr. Putin should not forget.
Very interesting. I cannot tell you how interested I am in your presentation tonight. It'll be at Kerner Johnson Building's Bradford Auditorium this evening at Hamilton College. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you so much for taking the time with us. We really appreciate what you're doing out there.
Thank you very much. Great to be on your show. Thank you.
Thanks. How about that?
That's good.
I mean,
crazy.
The man has been, they've attempted a murder and assassination on him twice, and he's survived and still going. Pretty wild.